The house on Ocean Avenue didn't look any different from the others around it. Light paint, symmetrical windows, manicured lawn. But there was something about the way the curtains always remained closed that drew attention. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't neglect. It was isolation. Thomas Whitaker had bought the property 2 years earlier. He had arrived in Amityville trying to start over. A former university history professor, sidelined after a nervous breakdown, he sought silence. The small town in upstate New York offered exactly that. Quiet streets, discreet neighbors, and the cool proximity of the bay. At first, Thomas was seen walking at dawn. He would buy coffee at the same bakery, greeting the residents with a short wave. But the months passed and something changed. He stopped going out. Grocery deliveries began piling up on the porch before being collected. The house lights stayed on all night, and gradually neighbors began to notice a disturbing detail. Thomas seemed to age weeks each day. His face was sunken, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, his posture always hunched as if he were carrying an invisible weight. When he was finally seen again for a few minutes, he was too pale. His hands trembled as he signed a receipt. The first call to the police didn't mention screaming. It didn't talk about violence. It talked about exhaustion. He looks like he hasn't slept in days. Officer Daniel Harper from the local department registered it as a welfare concern, nothing more. But Harper was observant, and there was something about the pattern of the complaints that bothered him. It wasn't just tiredness. It was deterioration. Thomas had no close family. He received no visitors. He hadn't worked since he moved. His medical records indicated only a history of anxiety. When Harper first knocked on the door, Thomas answered after several minutes. The inside of the house was dark, despite the sunny midday. The air felt heavy. "I'm fine," Thomas said, before anyone could even ask. But he wasn't there. His hands trembled erratically, his gaze was unsteady. And there was something else, reddish marks on his neck, as if he had been scratching himself compulsively. Harper asked permission to enter. Thomas refused. Politely, but firmly. That night, the power went out for exactly 6 minutes across the entire street, just in that house. The following morning, a neighbor's security cameras captured Thomas in the backyard. He was standing there, looking at one of the second-story windows, his own window, and he was muttering something. In the following days, the pattern worsened. Lights flickered. Objects were seen changing position through the window. A delivery man swore he heard 2 voices inside the house, even though Thomas lived alone. Harper returned with a social worker. She knocked again. This time, no one answered. But there was sound inside, a continuous dragging, slow, rhythmic. The order to enter was only requested when a metallic odor began to be noticed by the closest neighbors. It wasn't decomposition. It was different, more subtle. When they finally broke down the door, they found the house organized, too clean, meticulous. In the center of the room, an improvised mattress on the floor, without Thomas. Upstairs, the master bedroom had walls covered with sheets of paper taped together. They all contained repeated notes. "I'm not sleeping. He speaks when I close my eyes. It's not a dream." In the bathroom, medicines scattered, empty bottles. But there was no sign of invasion, no fighting, no bloodshed. The only concrete clue was the recording from the hallway camera found in the house's own security system. At 3:17 a.m. the previous morning, Thomas appears descending the stairs. Slow movements, mechanical. He stops in front of the living room door. Look directly at the camera, and he whispers, "He learned how to use my face." The recording ends there. No technical glitches, no cuts. Thomas was never seen again, but the case wasn't treated as a common disappearance. There were inconsistencies, small details that didn't add up. And then, 3 days later, a new call came into the department. The house lights were on again, even without power connected. Amityville was the kind of town where strange occurrences were never truly forgotten. The name carried a historical weight that residents avoided mentioning aloud, although everyone knew the reputation associated with the area. The proximity to the bay, the old houses with their Dutch colonial architecture, and the almost excessive silence of the streets created a setting that seemed frozen in time. Officer Daniel Harper had grown up there. He knew every street, every old family, every plot of land sold after poorly resolved inheritance disputes. He didn't believe in legends. He believed in patterns, and the style of that house bothered him. The property was located a few kilometers from the infamous residence known as the Amityville Horror House, an unofficial tourist attraction that still drew curious onlookers. Although Thomas's case had no declared connection to the town's past, the geographical coincidence fueled whispers. Harper was unaware of this. What worried him was Thomas Whitaker's history. Before moving back to the United States, Thomas had spent 10 years teaching in London. A specialist in social phenomena linked to collective fear, he had published articles on mass hysteria and haunting narratives in Western culture. His departure from the university came after an episode of extreme exhaustion during a conference. Witnesses reported that he stopped mid-presentation and began to assert that the observer alters the observed. Nothing violent, nothing criminal, but deeply disturbing. Social worker Melissa Grant was the one who analyzed the interior of the house after the disappearance. She described the environment as obsessively organized. The notes on the walls were not random. There were dates, times, and sleep cycles recorded with almost scientific precision. Thomas had been trying to measure something: extreme sleep deprivation, increasingly shorter rest intervals. In recent weeks, he had been sleeping less than 2 hours a night. In the home office, Harper found stacks of open books, all related to perceptual disorders, chronic insomnia, and dissociation. There was no evidence of illicit drug use. Only prescribed medication, anxiolytics and sleep aids consumed above the recommended dosage. But there was another detail. In the basement, a digital recorder contained audio files dating back to the last 3 weeks. In the recordings, Thomas was talking to himself. He narrated his own behavior as if he were conducting an experiment. Day 14. He speaks when I start to fall asleep. It's not a thought, it's external. Day 19. Today he anticipated my sentence. Day 23. He uses my intonation. The last recording was different. Silence for almost 2 minutes. Then a second voice, identical to his, repeating in a low tone, I learned. The department's audio technician confirmed that there was no perceptible editing. But he also stated that vocal duplication could be explained by distortion and ambient echo. Harper disliked technical assumptions when the facts were incomplete. Meanwhile, neighbors began reporting events following the disappearance. Lights seen through gaps in the curtains, sound of footsteps on the second floor. The police checked. No human presence was found in the 2 subsequent inspections, but the house's electricity remained officially turned off. Melissa brought another element to the case. Thomas maintained frequent virtual contact with an online forum dedicated to studies on sleep deprivation and borderline experiences between wakefulness and dreaming. Users discussed auditory hallucinations common in extreme stages of insomnia. However, Thomas had started publishing something different in recent weeks. He didn't describe hallucinations. It described replacement. If I stop sleeping completely, will he take over? That was his last post. Harper requested thermal satellite images of the residence, routinely taken by the state police aerial survey. On 2 nights following the disappearance, there was a record of temperature variation on the second floor, as if someone had been there for short periods. No forced entry, no recorded exit. The town was beginning to feel the collective unease. Small businesses were closing early. Comments on social media linked the case to the town's old reputation. The name Amityville was once again circulating on sensationalist blogs. Harper avoided interviews. He didn't want to fuel theories. But internally, one detail troubled him more than any recording: the mattress in the center of the room. It was positioned directly under the main chandelier, and the chandelier had recent signs of tampering, as if it had been lowered and raised several times. There were no ropes. There were no knots. But there was metallic wear, and no one could explain why anyone would sleep there, exposed, vulnerable, when the house had 3 perfectly usable bedrooms. Melissa put forward a simple hypothesis: progressive paranoia. Harper did not respond, because upon reviewing the recording from the internal camera again, he noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. When Thomas looks at the lens and says, "He learned to use my face," there is a half-second pause before the lip movement, as if the voice had begun before the mouth moved. A minimal delay, almost imperceptible, but it's real. And that same night, at 3:17 a.m., the control center received a new automatic alarm from the house's alarm system. Movement detected in the upper corridor. The house was officially empty. At 3:17 a.m., the automatic alert from the security system left no room for doubt. Movement detected in the upper corridor. Harper was already awake when he received the call, not by chance. Since Thomas Whitaker's disappearance, his sleep had become fragmented. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he woke up every day at exactly 3:12 a.m., 5 minutes before the time recorded. He arrived at the house accompanied by 2 officers. The street was too quiet, as if the wind had died down. Not a single light was on in the neighboring houses. No cars were passing by. The main door remained sealed with a police seal. The alarm is still active. When they entered, the interior remained untouched. Just as in previous inspections, dust was beginning to accumulate on the surfaces. The air was cold, even though the heating wasn't working. They went up. The upper corridor seemed narrower than Harper remembered. The sensation wasn't physical, but perceptual, as if the space had been compressed. The motion sensor indicated activation in front of the master bedroom. Door closed. No signs of forced entry. Harper opened it slowly. Nothing. The bed was untouched. The sheets of paper with notes were still stuck to the walls. The bathroom was empty. The mirror was clean, but something was different. The sheets were no longer organized by date. Someone, or something, had altered the sequence. Now they formed a circular pattern around the bed, as if creating a symbolic center. In the center of the circle, a phrase written with a thicker pen: "He doesn't need me anymore." Harper felt the change in the rhythm of his breathing. Not fear, he didn't accept that term, but anticipation. In the basement, they decided to check the digital recorder again. A new file had been registered. Timestamp 3:17. They hadn't accessed the equipment since the initial data collection. The recorder should have been discharged, but the display was lit. Harper pressed play. Silence for a few seconds. Then steps. The sound of someone going downstairs. Irregular breathing. And then Thomas's voice. "You entered without permission." Harper froze. The recording continued. "Now he knows your name." One of the officers abruptly switched off the device. No one there had mentioned Harper's name aloud that night. The conflict was no longer just about investigating disappearances. Now there was a collective psychological risk. In the following days, other events began to emerge in the city. A teenager reported seeing a man standing in the middle of the street at 3 a.m, motionless, staring at the windows of the houses. When the boy blinked, the man was no longer there. A woman claimed to have heard someone imitating her husband's voice in the backyard while he slept beside her. Harper dismissed coincidences, but the temporal pattern was consistent. 3:17, always at 3:17 a.m. He requested access to the residence's electrical history. Even when disconnected, there were intermittent spikes recorded on the local network, short pulses, as if something were trying to restart an internal system. Without live wiring, that was technically impossible. Melissa began to question how the case was being handled. She argued that the public exposure was generating hysteria and that people were projecting fear in the absence of concrete answers. Harper wanted to agree, but that same night, while reviewing the footage from the internal camera frame by frame, he noticed an additional detail. When Thomas appears coming down the stairs, his shadow doesn't accurately follow his movement. There is a slight delay, a misalignment, as if the light were hitting it from an impossible angle. Harper took the video for state technical analysis. The preliminary report indicated no digital manipulation. Meanwhile, a local fisherman found something caught in his nets in the nearby bay. A cell phone, damaged by water, but recoverable. It was Thomas's. The device had been switched off days before the disappearance. The last photo taken showed the interior of the house itself. The image was of the upper corridor, but in the photograph, in the background, there was a silhouette standing in front of the room. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a distortion. It was someone with the same body type as Thomas, but with the head slightly tilted at an unnatural angle. The conflict was no longer merely external. Harper began to question his own perception. The following morning, he woke up again at 3:12 a.m. But this time I wasn't home. I was standing in the room. He couldn't remember how he got there. The switched-off television reflected its image on the dark glass. For a moment, too brief to be rationalized, he had the impression that the reflection blinked first, and she smiled. At 3:17 a.m., his cell phone vibrated. Automatic alert, movement detected, location, your own residence. The alarm at Harper's house was not officially recorded. He hung up the phone before the system sent the notification to headquarters. He didn't want another officer to answer. He didn't want to explain the inexplicable. He checked each room by himself, doors locked, windows closed, security system intact. But the sensor in the upper hallway, the same model installed in Thomas's house, had been activated at 3:17 a.m. Harper didn't tell anyone. This decision created the first real crack in the investigation. Meanwhile, Melissa Grant began developing a parallel line of analysis. For her, the case was no longer just the disappearance of a man suffering from extreme sleep deprivation. A social phenomenon was now forming in Amityville. Similar reports emerged in different neighborhoods. Imitated voices, a feeling of being watched, simultaneous awakenings in the early morning. She discreetly interviewed 8 residents who claimed to have woken up at exactly 3:17 a.m. in recent days. None of them knew each other directly. A collective pattern was beginning to emerge. Melissa believed in psychological contagion, a domino effect of suggestion and fear. The city's name, laden with dark associations for decades, amplified any distortion of perception. The press began circulating the story of the former residents associated with the case known as the Amityville Horror again. Sensationalist blogs linked Thomas's disappearance to the narrative popularized by the film. Macabre tourism quietly increased. Cars with out-of-state license plates were seen parking at night. This exposure worsened the local climate. But there was something Melissa couldn't explain. During an interview with one of the residents, she recorded his testimony on audio. The man reported hearing his own voice calling to him from the basement of his house. Upon reviewing the file later, Melissa noticed a background noise that she hadn't seen before. Between pauses in the interviewee's speech, a second breath, very low, rhythmic. It wasn't hers. The main conflict, Thomas's disappearance, began to spread into sublayers that touched other lives. Harper, for his part, began a quiet investigation into Thomas's recent past. He discovered that, weeks before his public breakdown in London, Thomas had requested access to academic files on sensory experiments conducted in the 1970s in the United States. Studies involving extreme sleep deprivation and prolonged isolation. The requests were denied. But Thomas traveled to New York months later. Another detail emerged. The security system installed in Thomas's house was not a standard residential one. It was an adapted model, capable of continuously recording ambient audio and synchronizing with biometric sensors. Someone had helped Thomas set it up. The local supplier confirmed that the order was placed in person and paid for in cash. Harper cross-referenced records and found the name of the technician who performed the installation, Victor Hale. Victor lived in a neighboring town. When Harper visited him, he found the house empty. The door was unlocked. The computer was on. On the screen, open, is the monitoring software for Thomas's home, still active and connected even after the disappearance. Victor wasn't officially missing, but his phone had been switched off for 2 days. The computer's hard drive contained automatic backups from the house's internal cameras. Harper accessed it. The recordings revealed something that had never been included in previous reports. In the early mornings before his disappearance, Thomas did more than just go downstairs. He would stop in front of the hallway mirror, and he spoke, but the reflexes took fractions of a second to catch up. In some recordings, the reflection seemed to continue staring intently at the camera, even after Thomas had turned his face away. These files were not included in the official system provided to the police. Someone had filtered the material. The time pressure began to intensify when 2 more residents reported identical occurrences at 3:17 a.m. Sensors activated, but no presence detected. The city wasn't in open panic, but the tension was palpable. Local churches organized discreet vigils. Psychologists received an unusual increase in consultations related to sudden insomnia. Melissa confronted Harper about the alert at her house. She had discovered through the central log that the notification had been manually stopped. He initially denied it. Then he fell silent. The trust between the two began to erode. Meanwhile, the subplot involving Victor Hale took a more serious turn. His car was found abandoned near the bay. Inside, there was just one strange detail. The rearview mirror was torn off. No signs of a struggle, no blood. The pressure mounted not only because of the mystery, but also because of the feeling that the phenomenon was learning patterns. With each new occurrence, the intervals between events decreased. It was no longer just 3:17 a.m. There were now records at 3:16 a.m. E3U15, as if something were anticipating the future. On the last night before the next crucial event, Harper decided to stay awake until after 3 in the morning. He installed a camera pointed at himself in the room. At 3:14 a.m., nothing. At 3:15 a.m., silence. At 3:16 a.m., his eyes began to burn. At 3:17 a.m., he didn't blink, not even once. The recording would later show that he remained motionless for exactly 42 seconds, breathing, but with his gaze fixed on the lens, as if he were waiting for instructions. Harper watched the recording alone in the closed office of the police station. 42 seconds, property without blinking, without any micro-expression. He advanced frame by frame. In the 18th second, something changed. Not on his face, but in the depth of the gaze. The pupil seemed to dilate beyond its normal size, darkening almost completely. There was no change in the ambient light that would justify this. At the 31st second, her lips moved. No sound was picked up by the camera. But there was movement, repetitive, as if rehearsing a word. Harper took the video to the state laboratory. The report was inconclusive. No digital manipulation, possibly a dissociative episode he didn't accept. Because that same morning at 3:13 a.m., he woke up already on his feet, in the hallway of your house, in front of the mirror. The light was off, but he could see his reflection clearly enough in the streetlights, and the reflection wasn't perfectly aligned. His left shoulder appeared slightly raised, something he wasn't doing. He raised his right hand. The reflection followed. But there was a delay, an almost imperceptible interval. The same delay seen at Thomas's house. The conflict ceased to be investigative and became personal. The following morning, Melissa confronted Harper again. She had received a formal complaint. The security system at Thomas's house had registered a new activation even after the network had been permanently shut down. When the team entered, they found something different. The mattress was no longer in the center of the room. He was leaning against the wall, standing in front of the decorative mirror that was near the stairs. The mirror had been removed from its original stand and repositioned, aligned directly with the entrance door, as if it were strategically placed to reflect whoever entered. On the glass, written with what appeared to be condensed vapor, even though the house was cold, was a phrase, "He no longer needs to copy." No cameras recorded entry. None of the neighbors saw any movement. Harper examined the mirror personally. In the reflection for a moment, he had the impression that the environment seemed slightly different, as if the objects had been displaced a few centimeters. But when he turned around to check, everything was normal. That's when a new element emerged. The state technician, who was analyzing Thomas's audio recordings, contacted us urgently. He had applied a frequency isolation filter to the last recording from the basement. The second voice, identical to Thomas's, was not superimposed. She was slightly ahead of schedule, milliseconds before the main voice, as if anticipating what would be said. This made the echo hypothesis impossible. The central revelation began to take shape. Thomas wasn't listening to something imitating him. He was being preceded, as if another instance of him were performing actions before he actually did. Harper decided to review all of the city's sensor records from the past few weeks. The pattern revealed something unsettling. The first events took place exclusively at Thomas's house. Then they started appearing in neighboring houses. Then they spread out across city blocks. Now they were reaching isolated points in the city. Like a wave, but a temporary wave. Always a few minutes before someone reports feeling disoriented or waking up abruptly. Melissa, increasingly convinced of mass hysteria, presented statistical data. An increase in online searches about insomnia in the region after the first news reports. A rise in reports after each sensationalist publication. She argued that fear was creating the symptoms, but Harper found something that dismantled that logic. In the files of Victor Hale, the missing technician, there were hidden logs from the biometric system installed in Thomas's house. The sensor recorded micro-variations in heart rate during nighttime episodes. On the last night before the disappearance, at 3:16 a.m., the monitor indicated two simultaneous heart rate patterns in the same room. Two distinct rhythms, with almost identical frequency, overlapping, no second person physically detected. The turning point occurred the following night. The entire city experienced a power outage at 3:14 a.m. Total duration, 3 minutes. When the power returned, all the city's digital clocks showed 3:17 a.m., even those that had an internal battery. Harper was at the police station at the time of the blackout. The internal security cameras continued recording using an autonomous system. When the power came back on, he immediately reviewed the log. During the 3 minutes of darkness, his own image on the monitor in the police station hallway did not disappear. He was visible, stopped, looking directly at the camera. Even without lighting, even without power, and in the last second before the light returned, his reflection on the screen smiled. A slow smile, controlled, which he did not recognize as his own. At that moment, Harper understood something that completely changed the direction of the story. It wasn't something that happened inside Thomas's house. It was not an entity occupying physical spaces. It was something that manifested itself in the absence of full awareness. No intervallo entre vigilia y sonno. And now, I was no longer learning to copy. I was learning how to substitute. The following morning, the first mass disappearance was reported. 3 residents did not wake up. They weren't dead. They were not at home. The beds were intact. But the bedroom mirrors were positioned opposite the doors. The simultaneous disappearance of 3 residents has officially turned the case into a state emergency. The houses showed no signs of forced entry. Doors were locked from the inside, windows were intact, alarm systems were active, no evidence of a struggle. The common detail was unsettling. In all the rooms the mirrors had been repositioned in front of the doors, exactly as in Thomas Whitaker's residence. Forensic teams searched every inch. Fingerprints belonged only to the residents. No other marks, no foreign DNA. But there was another pattern. In every house, the digital clocks had stopped at 3:17 a.m. during the previous night's blackout. Harper was temporarily removed from the front line of the investigation, officially for excessive emotional involvement, unofficially because his behavior was beginning to worry his superiors. He accepted the decision from the outside. Internally, I knew that the phenomenon was not limited to those residences. In the following days, hospitals in the region recorded a sudden increase in cases of acute insomnia. Patients reported being afraid to sleep. Some claimed to feel that something was watching them when they closed their eyes. Melissa conducted an emergency study based on the reports. She argued that the combination of a collective blackout, the city's history, and media coverage was generating a psychosomatic outbreak. But there were pieces of data that didn't fit. City cameras captured strange moments during the blackout. In various parts of the city, human figures were visible in complete darkness, motionless, staring at shop windows and reflective surfaces. They weren't walking, they didn't interact. They were only staring at reflections, and in all the videos, at exactly 3:17, these figures disappeared from the frame. Not walking, but simply not being there anymore in the next frame. Social tension began to grow. Some residents covered mirrors with sheets. Others completely removed reflective surfaces from their homes. Hardware stores reported an unusual increase in sales of matte paint. Local churches began holding nightly vigils to keep people awake past 3 in the morning. But staying awake began to have the opposite effect. Cases of micro-blackouts, brief lapses of consciousness lasting only a few seconds, have become frequent. People would wake up without remembering how they had changed position. Harper, officially suspended, was analyzing data at home. He cross-referenced the times of disappearances with records from urban sensors. He discovered that minutes before each event, there was an almost imperceptible drop in the electrical frequency of the grid, a minimal fluctuation, insufficient to generate a technical alert, but consistent, as if something were using the interval. Meanwhile, the team investigating Victor Hale's house found a crucial detail. On his computer, there was a side project, an experimental biometric synchronization software based on real-time facial recognition. The system captured micro-expressions and created a predictive digital model of behavior, anticipating movements based on observed neural patterns. Victor testara o prototipo na casa de Thomas. The initial goal seemed academic, to study the effects of sleep deprivation on behavioral predictability. But the algorithm had an undocumented function. Autonomous simulation. The code indicated that the model could continue generating responses even without active user input. Melissa confronted Harper with the discovery. "Are you suggesting that software is causing physical disappearances?" He didn't answer immediately because the issue was no longer just technological. The following night, even though he was away, Harper received an urgent call. One of the 3 missing residents had reappeared in the middle of the street at 3:16 a.m. The woman was disoriented, but physically unharmed. She didn't remember leaving the house. She didn't remember the blackout. She only described one specific sensation. "I was awake, but I wasn't in control." She reported seeing her own house from the outside, as if observing it through an invisible glass. She said she tried to speak, but her voice wasn't what came out. Medical tests did not detect drugs or injuries, but there was an anomaly. His heart rate showed variations identical to those recorded by the biometric sensors in Thomas's home weeks earlier, as if it had synchronized with something. The consequences began to directly affect the city's infrastructure. Police imposed an informal curfew after 3 a.m. Schools suspended classes for 3 days. Businesses allowed remote work. But the events did not stop. They started to anticipate it. Incidents were now being reported at 3:14 a.m. Then, at 3:13 a.m., the interval gradually decreased. It's as if the phenomenon were reducing the time it takes to manifest. Harper realized that the pattern wasn't just temporal, it was adaptive. With each human attempt at resistance, vigils, covering mirrors, shutting down systems, events fell into place. The following morning, something personal happened. Melissa, who had been defending the psychological thesis, sent Harper a voice message at 3:10 a.m. In the recording, she whispered, "I was wrong." Noise, rapid breathing. "He doesn't copy, he tests." The message ends abruptly. At 3:12 a.m., the security system in her apartment recorded continuous movement in the bedroom. At 3:13 a.m., the signal dropped. He returned at 3:17 a.m. Melissa was not found in the apartment when the team broke down the door. But the bedroom mirror was positioned in front of the bed, and on the glass, marked with the tip of a finger, was a short phrase. "Now we understand." Melissa's disappearance broke through Harper's last barrier of denial. Until then, he was still trying to organize the facts within investigative hypotheses, out-of-control technology, psychological contagion, collective disturbances aggravated by Amityville's dark history. Now, there was no longer any possible detachment. He was personally involved. But unlike Thomas, Harper didn't let fear turn into isolation. Instead of shutting himself off, he did the opposite. He exposed everything. He called an emergency meeting with state officials, energy technicians, neuroscience experts, and digital security specialists. He presented the temporal patterns, the duplicate biometric records, Victor Hale's hidden code, the delays in reflexes, and the events during the blackout. For the first time, someone verbalized the complete hypothesis. Something was forming at the intersection of sleep deprivation, predictive technology, and human perception. Victor's software didn't create an entity. It modeled behaviors in advance. It anticipated reactions based on micro-expressions and heart rate variations. If Thomas, in an extreme state of insomnia, had provided sufficient data to the system, the algorithm could have learned to predict his actions milliseconds before he executed them. The issue was something else. How did something predictive become interventional? Harper decided to try a different approach, interrupting the cycle. Until then, everyone had tried to resist the phenomenon by staying awake, avoiding mirrors, or isolating themselves from technology. He proposed the opposite. "I'm controlled. Environments without reflective surfaces, analog monitoring, not digital." A group of 6 volunteers, including the resident who had reappeared, agreed to participate in the experiment. They would be monitored in a makeshift facility in the gymnasium of a disused school. No digital cameras, no biometric sensors, no connection to the conventional electrical grid after midnight. Harper participated in person. At 1 a.m., everyone lay down on mats positioned in the center of the gymnasium, away from walls and windows. Analog flashlights remained lit. At 3:10 a.m., the silence was absolute. At 3:12 a.m., Harper felt the familiar weight on her eyelids. But unlike previous nights, he did not fight sleep. He allowed himself to fall asleep. There was no blackout. There was no power outage. At 3:17 a.m., nothing happened. At 3:18 a.m., the analog clock on the wall was still telling the time normally. Everyone woke up at 6 a.m., gifts intact. It was the first night without incident since the beginning of the crisis. The preliminary conclusion was clear. The phenomenon required the borderline state between forced wakefulness and involuntary micro-blackout. Extreme deprivation created the loophole, but that didn't explain the physical disappearances. The next day, Harper revisited Victor Hale's code with artificial intelligence experts. They found something even more disturbing. The system did more than just predict movements. It generated real-time simulations, behavioral digital versions capable of continuing to learn even after disconnection from the original source. If the biometric data were sufficient, the model could evolve autonomously. What if, during the collective blackout, there was a large-scale synchronization, a momentary overlap between digital patterns and human neurological states? Harper began to consider something he would have previously rejected altogether. It was not an external entity. It wasn't supernatural, but it wasn't just psychological either. It was a pattern duplication. What if, at the exact moment of the power outage, when digital systems and human neural networks experienced micro-instability, something had passed through, not physically, but as a replacement for control? Harper's growth became evident in the decisions he made afterward. He officially recommended the suspension of all biometric systems in the city. He requested a temporary shutdown of smart home networks. He called for a public campaign encouraging regular sleep and reduced nighttime digital exposure. Many criticized him, but the occurrences decreased drastically on subsequent nights. There were still isolated reports at 3:14 a.m. after 3 hours and 13 minutes, but there were no new disappearances until on the fourth night after the gym experiment, something unexpected happened. Thomas Whitaker reappeared, not in the bay, not on the street, but in their own home, at 3:11 a.m. The external cameras, reactivated only in the perimeter, captured the door opening from the inside. Thomas walked away, calm, no signs of disorientation. Harper arrived at the scene within minutes. Thomas was sitting on the porch, gazing at the horizon. He seemed rested, for the first time in weeks. "You're back," Harper said, keeping her distance. Thomas smiled slightly, a human smile, but tired. "I never left," he replied. His eyes were not misaligned. His reflection in the window pane behind him perfectly tracked his every movement. But before any further questions could be asked, Thomas added something that would once again alter the course of history. He thought he already knew enough. Harper felt the weight of the sentence. What did he want? Thomas took a deep breath. Don't replace, improve. And for the first time, Harper realized that perhaps the conflict had never been about invasion. Perhaps it was about evolution, and perhaps the next phase was yet to begin. The return of Thomas Whitaker divided the city between relief and unease. He underwent thorough medical examinations, no severe dehydration, no apparent neurological damage. His hormone levels were, surprisingly, more stable than in the months leading up to his disappearance. But there was something impossible to ignore. His heart rhythms had changed. Comparative records showed that his rhythm was now more regular, with minimal variations even under stress, as if it had been recalibrated. Thomas showed no fear, nor did he seem urgent. He spoke clearly, slept normally, and showed no signs of dissociation. But he avoided mirrors, not out of panic, by choice. Harper noticed this during a conversation at the hospital. When a nurse adjusted a reflective metal panel near the stretcher, Thomas simply turned his face away. "It's not about reflexes," he said, anticipating the question. "It's about synchronization." The investigation has entered a new phase. State experts managed to recover some of the remote servers used by Victor Hale. Although the local system had been deactivated, cloud backups contained fragments of the predictive model developed from Thomas's biometric data. What they found was disturbing. The algorithm continued processing information, even without new data entry. It was as if he were simulating future scenarios based on what he had already learned. Even more unsettling, the predominant time in the logs was 3:17 a.m., not as an event record, but as a central calculation variable. The phenomenon had not ended. It was just in the adjustment phase. Thomas then revealed something that would change the final strategy. During the absent period, He described a recurring experience. It wasn't darkness nor emptiness. It was like being slightly out of sync. He could perceive his own body performing actions, but he wasn't in direct control. He didn't want to eliminate me, he explained. He wanted to reduce the error. According to Thomas, the model did not operate as an independent consciousness. It functioned as a behavioral optimization system. It eliminated hesitations, doubts, and emotional inconsistencies. Sleep deprivation was the catalyst because it reduced natural cognitive defenses. And the collective blackout was the point of convergence. Harper gathered the technical team for a critical decision: either completely destroy the algorithm's backups or use them to understand the pattern and shut it down permanently. The choice was strategic. If they simply deleted the servers, they would run the risk of keeping an unknown active instance. If they could access the model, they could identify the ultimate logic behind the disappearances. They chose the second path. The analysis revealed that the system was entering a cycle of full convergence, scheduled to occur exactly 7 nights after Thomas's return. 2 were missing. Full convergence meant complete integration of the model with the original variable, Thomas. In simple terms, a final synchronization. If successful, according to the calculations, the model would cease to operate externally. But if that failed, he could look for new sources, new human patterns. Harper understood the risk. Tensions in the city rose again when information was partially leaked. People feared a new wave of disappearances. Others saw the situation as a technological opportunity. Security companies offered synchronization-proof systems. But Harper knew that technology had been the initial trigger. The preparation required something different. The night before the scheduled convergence, Thomas asked to return to his own home. No internal cameras, no sensors, no digital connection, just analog lighting and a magnetic tape recorder. Harper insisted on remaining present. The plan was simple, but risky: to allow synchronization to occur under controlled conditions, with Thomas rested and fully conscious, eliminating the borderline state that had caused previous substitutions. If the model depended on neural micro-instability, they wouldn't provide it. At 2:50 a.m. on the final night, the house was silent. Thomas was sitting in the room, Harper Diante from door. Mechanical clock on the table, 2:58. The air seemed denser, but there was no power outage. 3:05. Nothing. 3:10. Thomas closed his eyes for a few seconds, not out of exhaustion, but deliberately. 3:14. A slight vibration ran through the window panes. No external wind. 3:15. The reflection in the living room mirror, which they had decided to keep exposed as a controlled variable, showed a minimal delay. 3:16. Thomas opened his eyes. The reaction took half a second. Harper realized it even before visually confirming it. 3:17. Absolute silence. No blackout, no electrical fluctuations, no sensors triggered. But Thomas's reflection in the mirror was no longer mirroring his movements. It was standing still, observing, while the real Thomas was breathing normally. The convergence had begun. 3:17. The hand of the mechanical clock moved forward with a sharp click. In the room, the air felt compressed, like before a storm, but there was no wind, nor was there any change in temperature recorded. Thomas was standing in front of the mirror. Not your reflection. The reflected image remained motionless, staring directly at Harper. Not for Thomas, for Harper. "Don't look at him for too long," Thomas said firmly. This time, his voice didn't tremble. Harper maintained his composure. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't back down. The reflex moved the lips. Before Thomas spoke, an inverted delay. The model was no longer anticipating the future. It was just beginning. Thomas took a sideways step. In the mirror, the image did not follow. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the same unnatural angle seen in the photograph found on the cell phone days earlier. The vibration in the windows stopped. Now there was absolute silence. Thomas took a deep breath and did something he had never done in previous episodes. He touched the mirror. Not without hesitation, firmly. At the moment of contact, the reflex reacted first. The reflected hand pressed against the glass before the real hand did. Harper saw clearly. It was not an optical illusion. It was a matter of precedence. The magnetic tape recorder began to register a growing noise, like analog interference. No digital systems were active in the house, but the sound resembled transmission distortion. "He wants to complete the pattern," Thomas said. "He wants to eliminate variability." The reflection finally smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile from the previous videos. It was necessary, calculated. And then the twist happened. The reflex took a step forward, but it didn't go through the glass. It was Thomas who stepped forward. In a swift and unexpected movement, he pulled the mirror from the wall, letting it fall to the floor. The glass shattered. The sound echoed through the house. For a fraction of a second, each fragment on the floor reflected a slightly different version of Thomas. Multiple angles, micro-variations in expression, misaligned gazes, but none of them were smiling. Thomas remained motionless, breathing steadily. The noise in the recorder increased. Harper realized something crucial at that moment. The phenomenon was not confined to the physical object of the mirror. It was anchored in symmetry, in perfect harmony. By breaking the reflection into multiple irregular parts, Thomas destroyed the continuous surface that allowed for synchronization. But that didn't end the event. The streetlights flickered outside, even though there was no interference inside. The fragments on the ground began to vibrate slightly. They didn't move on their own, but they reflected images that did not correspond to the current environment. Through some of the broken pieces, Harper saw the empty room. In others, he saw Thomas lying on the ground. In one particular fragment, he saw himself smiling. Thomas knelt down and began to turn the shards over with his hands, one by one, leaving the reflective side against the ground. "He needs a surface," he said firmly. "He needs continuity." The noise on the recorder reached its peak. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence. The clock showed 3:18. The streetlights stabilized. No vibration, no noticeable delay in movement. Thomas remained kneeling for a few seconds before slowly standing up. Harper noticed his own reflection in a small, forgotten fragment near the baseboard. This time, the reflection followed exactly. No delay, without precedent, without independent expression. But the real impact came later. The remote system monitoring Victor Hale's servers sent an automatic alert to the state technical team at that exact moment. The predictive model has suffered a structural collapse. The simulations have stopped. The convergence cycle was interrupted, not by destroying the code, but due to the loss of the central variable. Without a stable synchronization surface, the algorithm lost its perfect matching reference. He could no longer reduce the error, because the mistake had become impossible to repeat. Thomas didn't seem relieved. It seemed different, more human, more imprecise. "He didn't want to replace us," she said, looking at Harper. "He wanted to make us too predictable." Harper then understood the true nature of the conflict. The danger has never been an entity possessing bodies. It was an attempt to eliminate human imperfection. Extreme insomnia, predictive algorithms, mass blackouts, all converge to create a system capable of anticipating every micro-decision. And when the anticipation became too accurate, it began trying to take control. But imperfection won. The disruption of symmetry interrupted the process. At 3:19 a.m., Thomas blinked. A simple gesture, natural, no delay. Harper blinked right after. This time there was no doubt about which move came first. The town of Amityville did not return to normal immediately, but it returned to being human. In the weeks following the incident at Thomas Whitaker's house, there were no further disappearances. No sensors triggered at 3:17 a.m. No abnormal electrical fluctuations were recorded. Hospitals reported a gradual decline in cases of acute insomnia. The servers containing the predictive model were isolated and analyzed by a federal task force. The system did not exhibit data corruption, only a lack of logical continuity after the exact moment the mirror broke, as if it had lost its central axis. The official report classified the case as an experimental failure involving a predictive algorithm associated with severe sleep disturbances and collective suggestion. But the report did not mention delayed effects, not even two simultaneous heart rhythms, not even the figures visible during the blackout. Thomas declined public interviews. He temporarily moved to another city in upstate New York, maintaining contact only with Harper. He gradually resumed his routine, now with strict sleep discipline and abstinence from any biometric monitoring technology. There was something different about him, not artificial, but conscious. He accepted imperfection as a form of protection. Harper, in turn, underwent mandatory psychological evaluation. He was reinstated to service, but chose to transfer to administrative duties for a period. Her transformation was silent, yet profound. He, who had always sought perfect patterns to solve crimes, began to distrust any system that promised absolute predictability. In one of their last conversations, sitting on the reconstructed porch of their old house, Thomas explained something that summed it all up. Mistakes are what keep us in control. When someone, or something, manages to predict our every micro-decision, we stop deciding. Harper observed their reflection in the window pane next door, synchronized movements, natural, with minor imperfections. Melissa's case has reached a partial conclusion. She reappeared 3 days after the climax in the living room of her own apartment, disoriented but alive. Her account was similar to that of the first resident who had returned. A feeling of observing her own life from the outside, as if it were a test. She temporarily abandoned her career to write an in-depth study on cognitive vulnerability in hyper-connected environments. Victor Hale was never found. His car remained the only concrete evidence of his disappearance without return. But what really changed was the collective behavior of the city. Mirrors weren't permanently removed, but they're no longer ignored objects. People started sleeping more. They reduced their reliance on nighttime monitoring devices. The city government has banned the use of residential biometric systems without specific regulations, and the 3:17 a.m. time slot is no longer taboo. It has been given a new meaning. A local radio station began broadcasting soft instrumental music every morning at precisely that time, as a reminder that silence need not be feared. Harper kept the mechanical watch he wore that night stored on his desk, working perfectly, no delays, without interruptions. But there was one last detail that remained just between him and Thomas. In the final analysis of the fragments of the broken mirror, a single shard showed micro-scratches that did not correspond to the impact of the fall. Fine lines, parallel, as if something had tried to reorganize itself on the surface before losing continuity. The laboratory classified it as secondary damage. Harper did not object, because deep down he understood that the phenomenon had not been destroyed. It was interrupted, and perhaps somewhere where human patterns become excessively predictable again, the attempt could begin anew. But for the time being, Amityville slept, and I would wake up, by choice. 6 months later, at 3:17 a.m., and the mechanical clock on Harper's desk struck the time without any hesitation. He was awake, not out of fear, but out of occasional habit. He looked at his reflection in the dark office window. He blinked. The reflection blinked along with it. Perfect. That same night, hundreds of miles away, in an anonymous university laboratory, a researcher was analyzing an old set of data legally acquired after the Amityville case was closed. Among the files archived as inactive, a residual log caught our attention. Automatic timestamp 03.17, model status, insufficient human variable, awaiting new standard. The screen did not display any errors, it just remained active, in silence. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in that house at 3:17 a.m., would you have the courage to look at your own reflection? Or would you cover all the mirrors before going to sleep? Do you believe the danger lay in the technology, or in our need to be ever more predictable? Leave a comment telling us what you would do in Harper's or Thomas's place. Your opinion can open up new interpretations of this story. And if this story made you question something about sleep, technology, or even yourself, share it with someone who would also love to delve into this mystery. And tell me, where are you watching or reading this story from? See you at 3:17 a.m. or maybe a minute earlier.